Hi everybody, and welcome to section 2. We're going to cover types of faults. First, we're going to talk about what we call a normal fault. Why do we call this the normal fault? Gravity acts in which direction? It's going to pull things downward. Sometimes when we have a weakness between two blocks of rock, one of them will split off from the other and be dragged downward by gravity. We call this one a normal fault. This happens most often whenever those two blocks are being pulled apart. As they're being pulled apart, one of them will slide down relative to the other one. We can also have the opposite. We call this a reverse fault, where one block is being compressed. It's being smashed into the other one. The amount of force gets to be so great that it starts moving up. This is under compressional stress. We could also have a case where two blocks are not being shoved against each other, but sliding past one another. And if we have these two blocks moving past each other, this line right here we would call the strike line. This is what they're slipping along, so we would call this a strike-slip fault. And finally, sort of the special case of number 2 is what we would call a thrust fault, where instead of one being moved up relative to the other at a high angle, instead, it's almost like a sheet of rock from one starts to climb over the other one. This is a reverse fault where the motion is at a very, very, very low angle, 10, maybe 20 degrees. We talk sometimes about the hanging wall and the foot wall. You can see even if we have a reverse fault or a normal fault, two different kinds of motion, the geometry is the same. You can imagine maybe you went out into the field and you saw a fault, but you didn't immediately know what had moved where. Well, either way, you could still split this geometrically into a hanging wall and into a foot wall. And the best way to remember this is to think about a miner. These are actually old mining terms which geology has taken use of. And he's here looking for ore along the fault between these two blocks. He's right here, and he notices that there's the hanging wall above him, which if he wanted to, he could hang from right here, hang his lantern on it. We have the foot wall beneath him. Here, he could put his feet. So let's go ahead and look at an example here. This is from the state of Utah. Maybe take a minute to pause and try to figure out what sort of fault we're looking at. What would be your explanation for what's going on here? So, the amount of motion here, you can imagine that this was originally down here. And what has happened is it has been shoved up like this along this surface. What would that make it? Make it a reverse fault. Now, this one, you might want to take a moment to pause. So what is happening here? Well, this block may have moved up, but it seems more likely that there was this break between them and this block moved down along this surface. What would that make this? Just make this a normal fault. And finally, you can imagine that you came across this from your private helicopter and you saw, well, there's this break right here, just something that clearly cuts across the landscape. And this white band is over here on one side of that break, and it's over here on the other side of the break. What's the most likely explanation? We have a strike-slip fault. Notice that this side has moved to the right relative to here where we're standing maybe, but if we were standing on this side, then it looks like this one has moved to the right. Next section is going to talk about seismic waves.